In this whiteboard lecture, we are going to be covering the supply side of the market now. Just like when we talked about demand, we want to make sure that we distinguish the difference between the supply of a good or service and the quantity supplied of a good or service. So you'll see that I have the definitions right here. When we are referring to the total supply of a good, we are talking about the amount of that good that producers or firms are going to be willing and able to offer for sale at each possible price during a specified period of time, everything else held constant. And then quantity supplied is just the specific amount that a firm would be willing and able to offer at a specific price, everything else held constant. So you'll notice that they're very similar to our definitions for the demand side of the market. Just like I explained when I was covering the demand side of the market, it's very easy to distinguish the difference between supply and quantity supplied when you are looking at it graphically. So the supply of a good or service is going to constitute the entire supply curve like we see here, going from point E to D to C to B to A, whereas just the quantity supplied, if I'm referring to the quantity supplied, I'm just referring to a specific point on the curve. So notice that I've circled point A here, meaning that at a price of $5, I can come across to see where I intersect my supply curve, and I see that that would correspond if I go down here with 60. So that would mean at a price of $5, the quantity supplied would be 60. Whereas again, if I'm talking about the supply of a good or service overall, I'm referring to the entire curve, taking every price point into consideration. Now notice that the supply curve has the opposite slope of the demand curve. The demand curve was downward sloping with an inverse relationship between price and quantity, whereas our supply curve is upward sloping with a positive relationship between price and quantity. So there's a positive relationship between the amount that a firm wants to sell in relation to the prevailing price of that good, which makes sense. If the price goes up, firms are going to want to sell more because it's going to be more profitable. Whereas if the price goes down, then they're going to want to sell less because it's going to be less profitable. Economists refer to this relationship between the price and the quantity supplied as the law of supply. So again, like I said when I was covering the demand side of the market, the textbook reading assignment is going to give you a very long, drawn-out definition of the law of supply, about a paragraph long. But I'm not expecting you to memorize the specific verbiage of the law of supply. I just want you to understand what it is. And so the law of supply basically states that as the price of a good rises, the quantity supplied will rise, and then of course as the price of a good falls, the quantity supplied is going to fall. And then of course at the end of that definition, what should be written there is everything else held constant. So what am I referring to when I say everything else held constant, meaning all the other factors related to the supply of that good other than price cannot be changing for the law of supply to hold. So what do we call these other factors that are related to the supply of the good? We refer to them as the determinants of supply. These are the factors that determine why the supply is in the market to begin with. And these are the primary determinants that I have listed here on this lecture slide. Number one being the price of resources that are used to produce the good or service. Number two, availability of technology in the marketplace related to the production of that good. Number three, the expectations of the producer. Number four, simply the number of producers. And number five, although it's not necessarily covered in your textbook, we know that taxes and subsidies also have an impact on the supply of the good. Now, anytime one of these determinants of supply change, so if there's a change in any of these, what that means is that supply changes. And if supply changes, then graphically what that means is that the supply curve shifts. So again, if any of these determinants of supply change, that means supply of the good or service will change, and graphically that means the supply curve will shift. So what I will do is walk you through a few examples so that we can see how, when the determinants of supply change, exactly how they are impacting the change in supply. So the first determinant of supply I will go over is simply the price of resources. You'll recall that the resources are the land, labor, and physical capital that firms use in order to produce their goods and services. So we start out with our supply curve for a particular good or service, and it's going to be upward sloping like so. And then let's say that the cost of the resources increases. So now firms have to pay more for either their land, labor, capital, or a combination of them. So an example of an increase in a cost of resource would be if the firms had to pay their employees higher wages. Suppose they primarily hire minimum wage workers and the minimum wage goes up. Therefore, the cost of their labor has increased. When that occurs, that will actually cause the supply of the good to decrease, which graphically means the supply curve would be shifting to the left like so. So a leftward shift of the supply curve would illustrate that the supply of the good has decreased in the market. And so again, this can be caused if the cost of resources increase. Now, of course, the opposite would happen if the cost of resources were decreasing. If firms were paying less for all of their resources, then hypothetically what would happen is the supply would increase and the curve would be shifting in the other direction. The second determinant of supply would be right here, technology and productivity, and more specifically, how new technology impacts productivity or the supply of a good or service. Generally, firms are not going to invest in new technology unless it's going to make them more productive. In other words, imagine if you were an owner of a business and you were going to spend a lot of money on some new piece of machinery for your business. You wouldn't spend money on that capital investment unless you had the expectation that it was going to allow you to become more productive. So anytime there is new technology in the marketplace, this is going to lead to an increase in supply of the good or service. So again, it just would not make sense to invest in new technology if it was going to make you less productive, because a firm wants to maximize its profits, not minimize its profits. So anytime I'm giving you a problem where the technology in the industry is improving, you can know that, or you can feel confident that what I'm looking for is a rightward shift of the supply curve, that the supply of the good would be increasing if that were to occur. The third determinant of supply is simply the expectations of the producer. Now, you'll recall when we talked about the determinants of demand, expectations were also a determinant of demand, but they were expectations of the consumer in relation to their income, expectations of prices of the product in the future or availability of the product in the future. When we're talking about the supply side of the market in terms of expectations, we are talking about the expectations of the producer, and generally those are going to be expectations that are directly related to the profitability of a product, because we do know that a firm wants to maximize their profit, so they're constantly going to be forecasting their profit expectations for the future. So let's say, for example, we have a firm that produces corn, and they expect that corn is going to be more profitable in the future. In other words, maybe they expect there's going to be subsidies, maybe they expect consumer demand is increasing. Something can be going on that would cause their expectation to believe that corn is going to be more profitable. So because of that expectation, that would actually cause them to increase the supply of that good. Whereas, again, let's say that that same farmer, instead of just growing corn, he also grows another crop. Let's say that he grows corn and he grows wheat. And so he believes that the corn is going to be more profitable than the wheat. Then that would mean in the market for wheat, we would say he would probably be decreasing his supply of wheat because he would be reallocating his resources to the production of the crop that he thinks is going to be more profitable. So the supply of corn would increase and then the supply of wheat would decrease because of that farmer's expectations. So again, expectations will influence the supply of a good or service. The fourth determinant of supply is simply the number of suppliers in the market. And this one is very easy to understand and illustrate. Basically, the more firms there are selling a good, the larger the supply is going to be. So again, let's say that this represents the supply of grocery products in Bakersfield. And let's say that 5 new grocery stores open this year. Well, simply because the number of producers has increased, there's now 5 more grocery stores in Bakersfield. That's the same thing as saying the supply of groceries has now increased, right? So anytime there's an increase in the number of producers of a particular good or service, that's going to cause the supply of that good to increase. And of course, vice versa. If we had said the opposite, if we were illustrating the supply of groceries in Bakersfield and I had said 5 grocery stores, shut down and were closed, then the supply of groceries would actually be decreasing. We would have less groceries, so the supply curve would shift to the left. Now, the last determinant of supply I wanted to cover would be simply taxes and subsidies related to the production of a good. So let's say, for example, that we're talking about the supply of tobacco products. So we have an upward sloping supply curve of tobacco products. And let's say that the government decides they're going to implement another tax. So they increase the taxes on the supply or on the production of the tobacco. Well, that is the same thing as saying basically that the cost of production has increased, just as if your resource costs have gone up, because now in addition to paying for your land, labor, and capital costs, the firm now has to pay this additional tax because the government has decided to increase the taxes. So just like we said when the resource price go up, if there's an increase in taxes, that theoretically should cause the supply of that good to decrease. So the curve would be shifting up like so. And then the opposite of a tax would be a subsidy. So if there's a subsidy in an industry, think of that as a negative tax. So if there's a negative tax, the opposite would occur. If there was a subsidy, then it's almost as if the government is paying you to produce your good. So the supply curve would be shifting the other direction. The supply would be increasing if the government subsidized the industry. So before I move on to reviewing what we've learned for the supply side of the market, let's make sure we understand the difference between a change in supply of a good versus a change in quantity supplied of a good. If we are talking about a change in supply of a good, that means we are always talking about the quantity supply changing at every single price level, which again is reflected by a shift of the entire supply curve. So if there is a change in supply, that means there has been a change in a determinant of supply. So that's what this graph is illustrating. Whereas if we are talking about a change in quantity supplied, so we start out with the same graph over here, that simply means there's been a change in the price of the good, which has caused the supplier to alter the quantity that they're willing to supply. So let's say initially the price of a good was $3. So we can go across and see, well, at $3, maybe they were willing to supply 10 units. But if the price goes up here to, let's say, $5, well, now we see that they are going to increase the quantity they supply. So instead of supplying 10, maybe they'll supply 15. So anytime there's a change in quantity supplied, supply itself doesn't change. We just move up or down the supply curve. So we're just moving from point to point along the supply curve when there's a change in quantity supplied. So a change in quantity supplied is always triggered by a change in the price. So let's review a couple of review questions to make sure that we understand the concepts of the supply side of the market. Suppose all blue-collar workers have received a substantial pay increase. What would happen in those markets in which the workers are employed? So this is something that we just covered. We have our supply of a good or service in an industry that utilizes blue-collar workers, and if the firm now has to pay more for those workers, that's the same thing as saying that the resource of labor has had an increase in the cost for the firm. And anytime a firm has an increase in their costs or resources, we know that that's going to cause the supply of that good to decrease like so. So looking at all of these answers, the one that you would choose would be E, supply would decrease. And of course we can see that graphically right here. Number 2 review question, if farmers believe that it is more profitable to produce wheat than corn, what can we expect? So this is actually identical to one of the examples that I just walked you through. We would have a supply of both the corn and the wheat, and then we can see how the supply would be impacted based on that farmer's expectations. If they believe that the corn is going to be, it says that the wheat is going to be more profitable, then that's going to cause the farmer to transfer resources to the production of wheat, so the supply of wheat would increase, and of course the supply of corn would be decreasing as they reallocate those resources. So when we review all of the different answer options we see the only correct answer would be, the supply of corn to decrease. The third review question, which of the following is not a determinant of supply? So again, we just covered all of our determinants of supply. We know it's the price of resources, technology related to the productivity of workers, the number of producers or firms that are selling the good in the market, and then we also talked about the expectations of the producer, and then taxes and subsidies. So we're basically just looking for an option on there that is not one of those 5 determinants of supply. And the only one that we can identify would be right here, the actual price of the good or service that is being sold. That is not a determinant of supply. The price of the good or service is just determined by, whatever the price is set by the market. So it's not a determinant of supply. All right, and here's a couple of true or false questions. Number 4 says, if there is a change in the price of a good, then the supply of that good will change. Well, again, I'll go ahead and draw a graph so we can see if that is the case. So we start out with the supply of a good, and it's saying that if there is a change in the price of a good. So again, hypothetically, let's say that an initial price was right here, and then we have this quantity that's demanded, and the price goes up to here, and that would cause this quantity demanded now. So there's a price change. We've already learned that a price change always triggers a change in quantity supplied. We move up or down our curve, but the problem is saying if there's a change in the price of a good, then the supply of that good will change. Well, we know if there's a change in supply of that good, that means the entire curve is shifting because a determinant of supply has changed, and that's not what has happened here. In other words, if there's a change in the price of a good, what actually changed is the quantity supplied. So sometimes students can find that a little tricky. In other words, the difference between quantity supplied versus a change in supply. So in this example, number 4, just the quantity supply change, not the actual supply. So number 4 would be false. And then number 5 says, true or false, assume the supply of steak is upward sloping. So we actually have an upward sloping supply curve right here on our graph. It says if the price increases from $4.25 to $8.60, a greater quantity of steak will be supplied. And so again, we can just use the same graphs. Pretend that this right here says $4.25 and this says $8.60. And indeed, we see that's exactly what would occur. If the price of a good increases, that causes us to move up along our supply curve, which causes the quantity we supply to increase. So notice here we went from supplying 10 to now supplying 15. So number 5 would be absolutely true.